Thank you
Yeah,
so much for
sorry.
joining. I know the time zone thing is kind of tricky. I understand it's 9:01 p.m. in New Delhi anyway. And I've taught in the middle of the night, early morning here, because I have a lot of students in India, so I certainly have been on both sides of it. So what we'll do over the next hour is understand Azure Arc. Let me get control of the proper monitor. Hopefully you're seeing my slide deck. I have three learning objectives. First, we're going to briefly understand why did Microsoft develop this product called Azure Arc? What value does it bring you in your business? I'm going to do a demo to show you how to start using Azure Arc for servers. You'll learn how to connect both Windows Server as well as Linux machines into your Azure subscription. And then we'll look at, again in demo, some of the things that you can do in Azure through the Azure Arc service. I want to encourage you to ask all of your questions. If you would go on mute, if you're not on mute, it'll kind of make the audio easier to handle. Pop your questions in the chat window. I know the chat window goes by kind of quickly, so if I miss anything, Kasam, please let me know if there's any questions surfaced that I miss.
Sure.
As far as the session materials go, I'd like you to write down, or you can just browse to this site directly, timw.info/arc, timw.info/ARC. And that will directly download a small zip file that contains a PDF of this slide deck, as well as a couple script files, a Linux shell script and a PowerShell shell script that give you a leg up on onboarding machines into Arc. And we'll reference those files a little bit later in our first demo. And if you missed this URL now, I'll bring it up at the end of the presentation as well. So our first question is understanding, briefly, the so-called elevator pitch. What value does Azure Arc bring to us in business? Well, first of all, we're going to constrain our discussion to really 1/3 of Azure Arc. It's called Azure Arc for Servers. And the idea here is that we're extending Azure management into our on-premises environment as well as other clouds. Now you see this is a screenshot from the Azure portal. We're going to see this in the demo in just a minute, but I thought it was useful to let you know that there's two other ways to go about this hybrid cloud management. There's the server piece, which is in public preview right now. We can start to use it, but I'll have a little bit more to say about what public preview means in a moment. But the other ones, the data platform, I learned just the other day, I got confirmation from Microsoft that they're not, the preview, they're accepting invitations for it, but they haven't returned any invitations yet because these products are still under development. Eventually, we'll be able to use Azure to manage your on-premises Azure Kubernetes service clusters, or even if you're running Kubernetes in another cloud like AWS, you can use Azure tools to govern those infrastructures. And you can do the same thing with your on-premises databases. There'll be initial support for SQL Server database, obviously, and also PostgreSQL. All right, but like I said, what we're going to do today is work with Azure Arc for Servers because that's the product that's actually functional now. The other ones are still under development. I created a Visio diagram here to kind of give you, in a nutshell, what we're talking about with Azure Arc. The problem that Microsoft was seeking to solve with Arc is a business that's looking to branch into the cloud, or maybe you've already begun branching your on-premises local environment into Azure, and not only Azure, maybe you're a multi-cloud business where you have some resources running in Google Cloud, other resources running, say, in Amazon Cloud, and you're having difficulty governing all of that infrastructure. Things like deciding who owns what, which groups in your businesses are responsible for which infrastructure, how are you going to control and govern cost, determining cost center management, how are you going to enforce inventory control and policy. You know, historically in a Microsoft world, on premises, we've had the System Center products to do inventory management and configuration management and alerting. Those are fine historically for our on-premises physical servers and our virtual machines. And it's true that System Center is still around and it plays well in Azure, but it's going to require something like a site-to-site VPN or an express route connection. That's not something every business can afford or wants to have to manage. So what we have here is using just the internet, no VPN involved, no express route involved. We can use TCP port 443 and SSL TLS protocol for secure communications, where we can use the Azure governance tools, things like taxonomic tags, Azure Policy, Azure Monitor Log Analytics, and Log Search to be able to use those seamlessly across all of our environments. That's what I'm trying to translate. So Arc provides this management plane that allows us to come down into our local network and apply Azure Tags Policy Log Analytics to that. We can seamlessly go into our EC2 infrastructure and AWS if we have that, our Google Compute Engine infrastructure and Google Cloud, and the list goes on and on. That's the basic value proposition. It's one set of cloud tools to govern them all right? Now, you probably are thinking, like I did, when Microsoft introduced Azure Arc during the Ignite conference a few weeks ago, the first question I thought was, is Microsoft kind of eating into their own business with Azure Stack? After all, Azure Stack is a portable version of the Azure public cloud, and it gives you a lot of those same features, tagging, governance, the ability to do platform as a service, database as a service, all that. And I have a good friend actually who works full-time doing Azure Stack implementations, and he helped me out quite a bit. And he said that most Azure Stack deployments in the world are hybrid, where the on-premises environment does have a link into the Azure public cloud. In his experience, only about 25% of customers are using Azure Stack in a completely disconnected way, like maybe on an oil tanker that's in the middle of an ocean, far away from any internet connectivity, a submarine that's miles under the water, a mine shaft, these kind of things. It's mostly hybrid. Where the point of Azure Stack is, let me jump ahead one bullet point, isn't so much that they can't have any communication with the Azure public cloud, but they need to keep their data on premises, maybe for data sovereignty or compliance regulation purposes, or maybe their on-premises data is just so huge that it would be impractical for them to migrate that into Azure. You see what I'm saying? So what we have, let me step back up one bullet point, is the idea of separating the management plane from the data plane. The data plane is where your application services and data live, and management refers to our management tools. So the idea here is that Azure Arc and Azure Stack are actually complementary. For instance, you can use Azure Arc in the Azure public cloud to manage your Azure Stack virtual machines without having to load extra resource providers in your Azure Stack implementation, because you're doing it from Azure Arc. That's the long story short. I just wanted to mention that as we go along here. Now, I said that Azure Arc, of the three services, for machines, and then for Kubernetes and containers, and then for the data platform, the databases, only the server is actually in use. The other ones are still under development. Azure Arc for servers is considered a public preview feature. So what this is showing you is a little extract from the supplemental terms of use. I always like to say this just to cover my bases. As you can see here on the highlight, public preview features in Azure don't have any service level agreement associated with them, nor are they usually covered by customer support. So the idea is that whenever you see preview after a feature in the Azure portal, make sure that you're using it only in a test dev environment. Now, there's some exceptions to that. If you've ever heard of Azure Migrate, Microsoft has been doing production support for Migrate for a while. It's just a case-by-case basis, and you'll want to stay plugged into the Azure Updates website to see what Microsoft's official policy on it is. All right, let's start getting into the practical weeds here, learning first of all how we can start to connect our servers to Azure Arc. The onboarding process is pretty straightforward, actually. First, you'll want to make the appropriate network port allowances. Now, I said that the communication here with Azure Arc does not require a VPN or an express route link. We're working with TCP 443, which is the SSL, TLS, or HTTPS protocol. So it's meant to be pretty firewall friendly. But if you look in the Azure Arc documentation, Microsoft does have some additional guidance for what are called service tag ranges. In other words, your network engineers who operate your enterprise firewall may not be happy saying, oh, well, we're going to allow all traffic into Azure. No. So in the docs, they have some specific ranges of public IPs, Microsoft IPs, that you can give to your network engineering team to make those allowances. That's in keeping with least privilege security. If you can't find the docs, it's pretty easy to find. Just do a Google or Bing search for Azure Arc documentation. At the end of this slideshow, I have the URLs contained for your reference. So once you're allowing the ports into Azure from your local environment, you'll want to deploy what's called the Azure Connected Machine Agent. So Azure Arc for Servers does require the installation of an agent. It comes down as an MSI package for Windows or a DEB package. Or right now, as of this point in time, it's only a couple versions of Ubuntu that are being supported, but eventually, of course, Microsoft will support all of the endorsed Linux distributions. And then optionally, you can install the Log Analytics agent. You might know this as the so-called OMS agent. I know this product has gone through like all sorts of naming changes. It's really confusing. But Log Analytics agent is going to pull all of your telemetry, your diagnostic data, your syslog, your performance monitor counters from your machines, and you can query them using the Kusto query language in a single surface. Some more details about this Azure Connected Machine Agent. I know if you work in industry, you're probably like, I'm not into agents. Who is? Who wants to maintain agents? But it is required in this case. And just to let you know what actually gets installed when you install the Connected Machine Agent, you'll get 2 services installed for both Windows and Linux machines. On Windows, the Connected Machine Agent service is called HIMDS. I'd be interested to know what that stands for. And the other is called DSC service. So one for the Connected Machine Agent and another specifically for guest configuration. And if you're familiar with PowerShell desired state configuration, or DSC, the majority of the guest configuration with Azure Arc for Servers is actually using DSC. And I was pleased to see that because DSC made a big splash a few years ago when Microsoft introduced it, and then it kind of seemed to get kind of quiet. I don't know if you'd agree with that or not, but it looks like the folks on the engineering team with Azure Arc are all in with DSC as a way to do configuration management. And the actual binary and supplemental files get installed by default under Program Files, Azure Connected Machine Agent. That's for Windows. For Linux machines, again, it's 2 services. The Connected Machine Agent service is called HMDSD. I think I spelled that correctly. And the guest config is called DSCD. And the path for the binaries is var opt AZCM agent. Say that 5 times quickly. The agent also has an executable that you can run locally on your managed servers to change the properties of how the agent behaves. It's not a graphical, it's just a command line utility. And then we have, as I said, for Log Analytics, this requires that you've deployed a, what is it called now? I think it's called an Azure Monitor Log Analytics Workspace. And if you deploy a workspace in your Azure subscription and go into advanced settings, as you see on the screenshot, you can download the agent software for both Windows Server as well as Linux. And notice in the diagram here, I'll try to point it out with my mouse, you just simply run the shell script on Linux, or on Windows, it's an MSI if I remember correctly, but you need to link into your Log Analytics workspace by providing the workspace ID as well as one of the 2 keys, secret keys to authenticate. All right, and that gives you the ability to manage all of the log and telemetry and diagnostics data from your connected Windows and Linux machines. And again, the idea is that these could be on-premises physical machines, on-premises virtual machines, or virtual machines running in another cloud provider. It doesn't matter. As long as you can get the path over TCP 443 into your Azure subscription, you can then use Azure tools to govern and control that hybrid cloud environment. So with that, let's look at onboarding Windows Server and Linux VMs. I'll switch over to my browser and see if there's any questions. Looks like there's lots of discussions, and it's really cool to see that going on. Hari's asking a really interesting question about, although you're doing TLS SSL encryption over the wire, is it possible to force tunnel it through a VPN gateway? Hari, I would imagine that's the case. Let me make a note in my notes document here. Can we do Arc over VPN? I don't see any reason why we can't, honestly, because it's just using web service protocols, but we do have to have a a routing path to all of, not all, but some of the Azure service tags. Like I said, you'll want to look in the docs article. Microsoft spells that out pretty well. So if we do a search in the Azure portal for Arc, we'll see an entry for Azure Arc, and right now we also have a separate category called machines. I'm going to show you in a moment. You technically don't need to browse there, but you can if you want to. If we go to Azure Arc, this is the welcome page that I'm sure eventually will be more than just an advertisement. Eventually it'll have a settings pane and everything. Remember, this was just announced a couple weeks ago. And this is a screenshot directly from the slides I showed you, where we can go to the server's blade, and then for Kubernetes and data platform, all you can do is sign up for the preview. I signed up for this a couple weeks ago and heard nothing at all. So if you've signed up and have heard nothing yet, it's not a message going into your spam box. It's a case that Microsoft isn't processing the invitations yet, because Azure Arc for Kubernetes and data platform isn't far enough along in its development. But when it is, you can expect to get a response. If you click Manage Servers, it takes you to the Azure Arc Machines view, as you can see right here. And you can see I have one of each, an Ubuntu Linux and Windows Server virtual machine all loaded up and ready to go. So I've onboarded a couple machines that are running in my local environment here in my office. So they're not in Azure, although they show up. The onboarding process here, if we click Add, it's going to just ask us a couple questions here. Technically, you don't need to go through this wizard. All you need is the underlying script. That's all this wizard does, actually. There's a path for adding machines interactively. And interactively means that you're going to have to sign into your Azure subscription in order to onboard the machine. And then there's an add machines at scale where you want to non-interactively onboard maybe tens or hundreds or thousands of machines, and you definitely are not going to want every one of those installations to stop and wait for you to authenticate. So what this path will do is take you into a help article that shows you how to create what's called a service principal. And if you're not familiar with a service principal, that's simply, it's like a service account in local Windows environments. It's going to be an identity in your Azure Active Directory tenant that's secured with a password or a digital certificate. And you're never going to log on as the service principal yourself. It's a service account, like I said. So what you'll do is in this PowerShell code, you'll create the service principal, you'll give it the appropriate permissions to onboard servers, and then you'll pass that credential into your script when you're onboarding. I'll show you the code for that in just a second. But probably if you're testing this, you'll go here, the interactive script. So if you click Generate Script, it's just asking you for some metadata here. What is your subscription and your resource group and your region? And notice as of today, today is December 12th or 13th, depending on where you are in the world of 2019. We have Azure Arc for servers available in only 3 regions: Southeast Asia, West Europe, or West US 2. And then for the package details, we select either Windows or Linux. Check the Azure Arc docs. As I said, they're supporting only a couple versions of Ubuntu at this point. So you choose your operating system, you specify your proxy server IP and port if you're using a transparent proxy at the edge of your internet connection. You can provide tags. This is an important principle of Azure Arc for servers because you may know that taxonomic tags form a foundation of Azure governance. This is a way that we can assign simple key value pairs. Maybe we could do location, local data center. And we can apply this during deployment or after deployment in order to classify our servers. If we click Review and Generate, all this is going to do is give us a script. And depending on whether it's Windows or Linux, it'll either be a Windows script or a Linux script. Windows looks like it's using the invoke web request PowerShell commandlet to pull down and unpack the MSI. And then it's just running MSI exec in quiet mode to install the package. And then finally, we have to do the handshaking or the connection between the machine, the local machine, and your Arc infrastructure. And that's going to call the AZCM agent.exe. Remember how I said when you install the connected machine agent service, you can then control it using a command line utility. That's what the AZCM agent.exe is. And what's neat about this code is that it's already pre-populated the subscription ID, the Azure Active Directory tenant ID, and if you added tags, it pops those into the syntax as well. So it's just meant to automate the process. Let me switch on over to Visual Studio Code because I've downloaded both of those script files so I can show you what they look like. Here's the one that we just saw for Windows, that's fine. If you're wondering what it looks like for Linux, it's a shell script, and it's running wget, which is essentially what invoke web request does in PowerShell, and bringing down a script file, a separate script file. And then we run that script file to install the services, and then we call the AZCM agent tool to handshake into our subscription. We have to provide our Azure Active Directory tenant ID, the location, and then the subscription ID that you want to link into. It's the same process for Windows and Linux. That's the idea. And then if you choose the onboarding at scale option, that's going to involve a little bit more work. I've created these scripts just as your convenience, for your convenience. And yes, they are in the files that I'm sharing with you. And if you missed the beginning of my presentation, hang on because I'll give you that URL at the end. So we see on line 4, we're defining a new service principal in Azure Active Directory. And we're assigning it to a built-in role called Azure Connected Machine Onboarding. We then set the permissions here. We can retrieve the password. We have to manually download the agent and have it ready. And then we can call the script and so on and so forth. So that's fine. Any questions, comments, concerns about that thus far? Microsoft intentionally tried to make the onboarding process as fast as possible. It's going to require you knowing a little bit of PowerShell, a little bit of shell scripting. But other than that, once you've completed that, then it's a question of what can you do in the environment. Let's see if I pick that up in the slides. I don't remember if okay. Manage servers through Azure Arc. One of the main things, the main way that it seems that Microsoft wants us to manage our machines in Azure Arc is through Azure Policy. Are you familiar with Azure Policy? Policy involves well, it involves these JSON files, these definitions, and there's a whole bunch of them that are geared towards this hybrid cloud Azure Arc for Servers infrastructure. This screenshot, which I'll show you in the demo in just a minute, is in a category called guest configuration. And some of these are kind of, less impressive maybe. Configure time zone on Windows machine. I mean, that could be important. There's other ones that deal with show audit results if there's any weak passwords on this box. Show results where you don't have specific applications installed. So the idea over time is that instead of using, say, System Center Configuration Manager policies, or using group policies, or even using Intune policies, although that's kind of a client tool, we're using Azure Policy to deploy these policies. So it's going to require, Azure Arc is going to require that you get up to speed with Azure Policy if you're not already. Let's head back over into our demo environment and see a bit more of what I'm talking about. So you can see I've onboarded two of my on-premises machines, one an Ubuntu server, another a Windows Server 2019 server. You'll remember that if you search for Arc in the portal, you've got the Azure Arc Home Blade as well as one for machines. And I mentioned you don't necessarily need this separate machines blade. You can, for instance, go to the virtual machines blade that you've probably well familiar with by now. And you can categorize based on properties here, resource group properties or types. So if we just do a search for virtual machines and we group by type or location, there's a particular entry here I was looking for. I guess virtual machines isn't giving us the granularity that I was looking for. So let's go to all resources. That might be better. If you've been following the Azure announcements and documentation, Microsoft's been pretty proud of this all resources view because they allow you to do things like show resources that are normally hidden in list views, and also to do, for instance, types where we could look for machines. And then specifically, I'm waiting for this thing to drop down here. Type. You can search by tags, for instance. So this, again, if you're using taxonomic tags, you can round up resources, not just necessarily virtual machines, but other Azure resources that have particular tags associated with them. And this is what I was looking for. When you do a filter for type equals, notice that you can filter to show only Azure Arc machines. So what I'm trying to transmit here is that the idea is that your on-premises machines that are brought into Azure via Azure Arc, your EC2 instances in AWS or Google Cloud, Google Compute Engine machines, you can bring them up and filter them in list views, as you see here, right alongside your native Azure virtual machines. They're meant to be, if not first-class citizens, high second-class citizens, for lack of a better term. Let's take a look at what shows up when we actually click into a machine that is being managed in our subscription via Azure Arc. You can see that the user interface here looks very similar to what we expect of a native Windows Server machine in Azure, doesn't it? We've got our roll-up here of metadata. What's this showing us? That's just basically an advertisement. We can look at control plane operations that happened on that machine. You know that activity log is a way to see who did what when on a particular Azure resource. And this is filtering the view to show only events that have occurred on this machine itself. And this is probably just in terms of onboarding the machine into the subscription. I haven't actually done anything additional with these Azure Arc servers yet. You know that role-based access control is a key principle of Azure governance. We can apply rules now or role assignments to our on-premises machines and machines running in other clouds the same exact way that we can do with our Azure native machines. Now notice that this is a subset of roles to what you might expect normally. We have the most common ones, owner, contributor, and reader, but we can delegate the ability to onboard machines to certain Azure AD users. And then there's some monitoring and data science related roles as well. Okay. Tags, as I said, is another important principle in Azure governance. Question I have for you, probably the most common pain point I've seen with the use of tags in Azure is inconsistency. The fact that if you have write access to a resource, there's nothing stopping your developers and administrators from creating their own key value pairs. Maybe, for instance, you want to govern according to project, and you've got a project where the key value pair is project equals learning. Well, you know as well as I do, if you're typing fast, it's easy to do something like this, and you can commit this change. And I've now kind of messed up my taxonomy here by introducing a misspelling. So a very common issue is once you start using tags to group resources, this is what I'm saying now isn't even specific to Azure Arc, it's really Azure-wide. How can you prevent stuff like this, errors like this from happening in your infrastructure? How have you solved that problem, for instance? It would be policy, wouldn't it? So we've got taxonomic tags, we've got role-based access control. Locks is something else. We can apply resource locks to our on-premises machines just like we can Azure machines. You familiar with locks? A lock is less of a security feature and more of just a sanity check feature. So we could put a delete lock on this resource. I'm not sure I want to try this because I don't want to mess up my demo. But the lock is going to apply to everybody, including administrators. So if I try to delete this virtual machine, I'm actually going to try it. Good. The lock gave us a little sanity check here. It's similar to how in on-premises Active Directory you have the protect against accidental deletion flag that you can add to your Active Directory resources. So locks are available to help us out in terms of preventing accidental deletes. You can even prevent changes here in Azure to that virtual machine by applying a read-only lock. That's nice that we've got that governance available to us. But then we've got policies, as you can see here. And like I said, if you're going to get anywhere with Azure Arc, you're going to have to understand Azure Policy, because this is the main way that you do your governance. Even stuff like tags, what I was saying a moment ago about how do you prevent your employees from introducing mistypes, forgetting to add tags, because this can really have big cost implications for your business. Remember that the main value proposition of taxonomic tags is that you can aggregate your Azure resources based on, say, a cost center. You know, in your subscription management blade, in your cost management and billing blade, when you generate reports, you can aggregate and create charts and graphs and reports based on tags, and you probably do, because let's face it, not every cost center is going to be contained within a resource group. 9 times out of 10 or 8 times out of 10, your cost centers are going to span resource groups or maybe even span subscriptions. So use of taxonomic tags is extremely important. And one way that we can enforce those, the main way, is by use of Azure Policy. Now, we're still in the context of just a single virtual machine that's running in my local data center. So if I go into policy here, it's going to show us any policy data, any compliance data for this virtual machine specifically. And notice that we can directly assign a policy or an initiative for this VM directly from within this blade. By the way, a policy is an individual JavaScript object notation or JSON file that defines some particular policy that you want to enforce. And policies have a number of effects. You can do something really low touch or low impact where you're just watching the resource and doing an audit, or you can actually have it prevent deployments from occurring. Nowadays, you can actually have policies that will make changes. That is, if you have a policy that says that your virtual machines have to be in a particular time zone, and the policy determines that the resource is not in that time zone, it will actually run an Azure Resource Manager template to make that change. So policy has gotten really powerful over the last year or so. An initiative is simply a container that allows you to deploy and manage multiple policies in one go. So your business may not have just individual policies, but a group that you want to apply and manage together. I would suggest that when you're working with policy, you not get so much here at the resource level, but you go to the actual policy blade where you can get control of everything. Actually, that brings up a whole other subject, doesn't it, about management groups. Again, I'm just saying this because it's in scope, definitely, when we're learning about Azure Arc. You may have virtual machines, physical machines in your on-premises data centers or in other clouds that you've onboarded into Azure Arc that span different subscriptions. But you may have Azure Policy RBAC, these sorts of things that you need to flow across multiple subscriptions to different Azure Arc virtual machines. So that brings up the concept of the management group. If you don't know what this is like a container, basically a container object, into which you can populate multiple subscriptions, and then you can apply policy at the management group level, and it will flow by inheritance down through all the subscriptions that are enclosed in the management group. It's a very powerful way to do governance. So as I was saying earlier, if we go into policy and go into definitions, we'll see an enormous library of these JSON documents, and they're broken into categories, as I said, and to look specifically at the ones that are pointed for Azure Arc, we can come down to the G's and go to guest configuration, or GC as Microsoft calls it themselves. And again, as I said, we've got a number of built-in policy. There's probably more out on GitHub. The folks on the Azure Policy team at Microsoft have all this stuff open sourced. If we do a search for Azure Policy Definitions GitHub, it'll take us directly to that repository. In GitHub, it's easy to find. It's just Azure/Azure-policy. And I'll bet there's a bunch in here that might extend what's visible here in the Azure portal. So what's this showing us? Audit VMs with insecure password security settings. There's that time zone one. Audit VMs that are not joined to a specified domain. So some of these look like they're initiatives. Some of them are individual policies. You can filter based on this list here. And normally what I recommend when I'm teaching this is that you create a duplicate of the built-in policy, and then you can customize it more to suit your business needs, and then you can make the assignment there. Otherwise, you can just go to assignments once you're ready to rock, and we can just do a direct assignment. That's what I think we'll do now. Let's grab that time zone example and say that we want to apply that to my two Azure Arc servers, Windows and Linux. I actually have no idea what time zone they're currently set for, but I'm going to say that they need to be in, say, the Pacific time zone here in the US. So when you assign either initiative, I don't want to assign an initiative, I'm just going to assign a single policy here. So let's step back and go to assign policy. You determine the scope of where you want the policy to go. And you can go as high as management group or as low as resource group. I'm actually going to scope this just to my Azure Arc resource group, so that way it'll affect only my Azure Arc servers that I've onboarded. I don't want to exclude any of the servers within that resource group, but you can make exclusions if you want to. Looks like it's showing us other resources besides just virtual machines. That's fine. The policy that I want to assign here is going to be, let me choose built-in as the type, and let me search for time zone. And we've got configure time zone on Windows machine, show audit results that are not set to the specific. For some reason, these particular built-in policies are affecting only Windows. You're going to find that some of these policy definitions are for only one OS, others are for the other OS. It really, again, it's in keeping with the theme in Azure that you've got change happening on a daily basis. And you just have to kind of keep coming back to check to see if there's anything new that might work in your environment. And of course, there's the idea you can build your own policies from scratch and test them out yourself that way. So this is just going to audit whether the VM is in the specified time zone or not. We're going to enable this policy. Let's go next. I don't know what the parameters are for this. It looks like this one doesn't have any parameters, which seems a little odd to me. This is the first time I've run this. Remember that Azure Policy can be as light as just auditing whether you're in compliance or not, or it can actually deny deployment or make changes. When you make a change, it's called a remediation. And when you do the remediation through Azure Policy, I hope it makes sense to you that you need to work under a given security context. The security context that Azure Policy will use comes from what's called a managed identity. This, again, is just a service account or a service principal, as it's called. It's an identity in your Azure AD tenant and that will provide the security context to do those actions. I don't actually need a managed identity here because this is just doing auditing. We'd have to look at the source code to see. It must be that there's a time zone hard-coded in the definition of this policy. Let me see, review and then create. So I'm just keeping interest of time because I know that we've got an hour and it looks like I'm approaching the 45-minute mark. I'm going intentionally a little light here. Once you make an assignment, you can view and revisit the details of that assignment in the assignments blade. Once you've got an assignment out in the wild, it normally takes upwards to 30 minutes for the endpoints to ingest the policy. You can then keep track of compliance and remediation up here in the first part of the settings. We can look at our compliance, and the idea is that you use these filter controls to drill down to look at the policy or the initiative that you're interested in. And you can drill in to see which of your VMs or physical servers are or are not in compliant, and then you could either just manually fix it, or you can take advantage of the remediation that's available in some Azure policies to go from there. That makes some semblance of sense? Although it says public preview, Azure Blueprints has been in preview for a long, long time. This is a way to do governance at a larger scale. I'll just mention this in passing. You can create a blueprint that defines how an environment should look. For instance, you can bring in RBAC role permissions. You can bring in Azure policies and initiatives. You can actually bring in Azure templates so that if the environment doesn't look the way that you need it to, you can remediate that. Blueprint's a pretty cool feature, and it does work with Azure Arc because it relies upon the same underlying artifacts, particularly role-based access control, taxonomic tags, and Azure Policy. That's, I think, the last thing I want to say about Azure Policy. If we come back to definitions one more time, and if you do a search here, let me change the type to built-in only, and let me do a search for tags. There's a whole bunch of really useful built-in policies that can help you get straight and get consistent with your tags. You can enforce that a particular tag and its value is applied. And like I said, the effects here are such that you can have Azure do the work for you and add the tag if it's not there. This particular one looks like it's going to deny the deployment, but there's a policy effect called what's it called? Add if not exist or something like that, that actually will add the tag if it's not already there. So that's policies. Absolutely central that you deep dive into that in order to get proficient with managing your Azure Arc servers. Like you see here, I've got my Windows Server one and I've got my Linux one. Just for fun, why don't we go back to the Azure Arc Machines blade and let's take a look at my Ubuntu Linux machine. You can look in the documentation for details on how often the Azure Arc managed servers will report back into Azure. I think it's every 5 minutes. And I was reading last night as I was researching for this presentation that the Microsoft engineers made sure that the guest agent never consumes more than 5% CPU. So they're aware of our common concern with agent software. We don't want it to be consuming too much resources on the machines. Okay, so the final bit I want to show you here deals with logs and monitoring. The ability to pull diagnostic data and telemetry data from your managed servers and surface that in Azure, the different ways that we can do that. One way that we can do that without using the log analytics is to use what's called Resource Graph. If you're familiar with the Resource Graph Explorer, this allows you to tap into your Azure infrastructure, including your Arc servers, using a query language Microsoft developed called KQL. It stands for Kusto Query Language. It looks and reads a lot like SQL. So what we can do is tap in. Here on the left, we've got this schema Alerts, management resources, resource containers, they look and act a lot like tables do. Resources is what we'll go into here. And if we expand this, it's pretty intimidating when you first look at it because it breaks down into all of the resource providers in Azure. I'm just going to give you a tip that if you want to look into the Azure Arc server specifically, you can add a where clause where the type is Microsoft.hybrid compute. The resource provider used for your Arc servers is not Microsoft Compute, it's hybrid compute. And it's not virtual machines, it's machines. So I'm saying here, show me everything from the resources schema where the type, where the resource provider is hybrid compute. Why did table resources invalid, unsupported? Oh, it's not resource singular, it's resources. You know, and this should have filled in. Let me just, for grins, copy that out. A nice thing about Kusto query language is that it's supposed to give you code completion. It's not now, it figures. That's what happens to us presenters. Everything works fine when we're alone, but when we're presenting, it doesn't work anymore. Let's go to results here. So it's saying, we're saying, show me all of our servers that are in this group, and it looks like it picked up the Ubuntu machine and the Windows machine, right? So it gave us the results that we wanted. My screen resolution is making things a little bit cramped, as you can see here. But the idea is these virtual tables. Let me quickly drill down into Microsoft.hybrid compute, is that you can get ideas of how to structure your queries by looking at the properties that are surfaced. So you can see here there's stuff about, you know, physical location, last status change. The idea is that you want to get up to speed with Kusto query language because it's going to dramatically increase your effectiveness when you're reporting on and monitoring your Azure hybrid environment. With or without Azure Arc, I'd suggest that for your homework, you deep dive not only into Azure Policy, but also the Kusto query language, because it's really where all Azure monitoring is going. Let me modify this query to show us both Arc servers as well as native Azure VMs. We can do something like this, where the type is hybrid compute machines, or the type is equal to Microsoft.compute virtual machines. And we can even go further. Let's say we want a summary. We can do summarizations. We'll say, show me count by type. So we'll do some grouping. So there's two. You might think, well, that's not particularly useful. It just returned a simple count. A neat thing about this Kusto query language is that you can dynamically create charts and graphs like this here. I don't know, maybe my syntax wasn't right. It should be showing both. Let me select everything and try that again. No, I must have made a mistake. Or let's see, or type equals Microsoft Compute. You get the general idea, I hope. We're using this query language to dynamically generate charts and graphs. And what's so beautiful, you can save these queries and share them. You can download the results. This is just within Azure Resource Graph Explorer. The way to really unlock is to go into your Log Analytics Workspace. If you create a Log Analytics Workspace, there's a free tier and there's paid tiers. We don't have the time to get into all the details there, but the idea is that the Log Analytics Workspace is essentially a data sink or a data lake where you can send your Azure resources, and with Azure Arc, you can download the agent and install it on your on-premises servers and have all of that data coming into this data lake. And you can use that Kusto query language to write queries across all of your resources seamlessly. So once you create the workspace, you'll want to onboard your machines. And the two places you can go for that are under Workspace Data Sources, where I just was here. There's a virtual machines entry. Azure makes it really easy to link your Azure VMs into a Log Analytics Workspace. Notice that my two machines show up right here. And I can just click the mouse a couple times and Microsoft will deploy the Microsoft monitoring agent to that VM and away we go. For your Azure Arc servers, you have to take a couple extra steps. What you need to do is in your workspace, come down under Settings, Advanced Settings. And then for your Windows servers, you've got a download link for the Microsoft Monitoring Agent, 32 or 64-bit. For your Linux servers, you can download a shell script. What I like about the Linux servers piece here is that you can just simply copy and paste this wget statement. It has the key and the workspace ID already embedded in it. So I was able to link my Ubuntu server into this Log Analytics workspace with just a single copy paste. That was nice. With Windows, it required downloading an MSI and pasting in manually the workspace ID in either the primary or the secondary key. So once you have your Arc servers in the workspace, the idea now is that you can, directly from the workspace, you can come down to logs, and we can start running queries using the Kusto query language. Unfortunately, I onboarded my Arc servers not too long ago. It's going to require at least 24 hours before you can start running queries. Let me just show you what the workspace looks like, the query surface. I'm going to do a search for Azure Log Analytics Query Playground. This is a free site that you can use to practice your KQL querying. Let me see if I can find the URL. I normally have to do a Google search to find it. Log Analytics Query, or a Bing search as the case may be. Let's see, what am I looking for? Crazy. Let me actually try a Google search. Like I said, it's how I normally do it. Azure Log Analytics Query Playground. And what it is, it's a web application that is pre-populated with all sorts of data. It's at portal.loganalytics.io/demo. portal.loganalytics.io/demo. You're using Microsoft's data. You do have to authenticate with your Azure AD or Microsoft account, but all of the data is coming from Microsoft's sample data, and they've got, I don't know how much data here. And this is what it looks like. So the idea is that you're using KQL queries to tap into, say, CPU, disk, network, free disk space. Show me all of my free disk space on Drive C for all of my Arc servers and my Windows, my Azure servers. Show me which Arc and Azure servers haven't received this particular Windows update over this time range. Show me my Arc servers that haven't done an anti-malware scan in the last month. So the idea is that you send all of your Azure services into your Log Analytics workspace, and then you use this single query language to write queries across them all. So that's why I said it's really important that you get comfortable with KQL. How can you learn KQL? I'm not a salesperson, so I never like to do sales stuff, but I do teach for Pluralsight full-time, and there is a really great Pluralsight course on KQL that Microsoft themselves sends people to. It's a really good course. So you just do a search for Pluralsight KQL and you'll find that course. And you know, hit me up on Twitter. I'm happy to send you a 30-day Pluralsight code. I have a bunch of codes. My Twitter handle is TechTrainerTim. I'll give that to you on the slide in just a moment. Alrighty, so I think that's the long story short here with Azure Arc for servers. To sum up, let's come back to the Arc Machines blade. To sum up, we're able to take our Azure governance tools, stuff like Azure Policy, role-based access control, blueprints, templates, Monitor, Azure Monitor, and Log Analytics, and use the same set of Azure control plane tools to stretch out of the Azure cloud down to your on-premises environment. And in order to unlock that, you have to install the Azure Connected Machine Agent on your Windows Server and or Ubuntu Linux machines to link them in. And once they're linked in, they show up in your browse lists along with your Azure virtual machines. And once again, you can start to use those same control plane tools with your Arc servers, just like you did before. Here on Activity Log for our Windows 1, notice that that audit policy assignment that we made earlier is now showing up here. Tell you, Activity Log is a really great tool. You can get to it centrally in Azure Monitor. I use that in my consulting practice all the time because the question is, who restarted that virtual machine last night? You know, who resized that Azure SQL database? Nobody's going to admit to it. But if you search Activity Log, you'll find an answer because there's nothing left to the imagination. Every single thing that happens in your Azure environment is going to show up in Activity Log. And once you've onboarded your on-premises machines via Arc, you can get that same level of transparency in that hybrid cloud. So what do you think? Questions, comments, concerns? Curiosities, anything I left out? Well, let me leave you with some reference links here. Again, these are in the PDF that I'm sharing, but I created short URLs to make it easier for you to find. The azure.com public page for Azure Arc, I've put at timw.info/arc1. I've given a link to the docs, the Azure Arc docs at timw.info arc2. And the Azure Connected Machine agent details are at timw.info/arc3. So I tried to make that as easy as possible, just to not a whole lot is out there yet because Azure Arc is such a new product. I mean, we've only covered in this hour the Azure Arc for machines. We've still got so much more yet upcoming in terms of AKS or Kubernetes in general, the container orchestration and container management deal. And then there's data platform, SQL Server, Azure SQL Database, PostgreSQL, and being able to manage those centrally in Azure. That's particularly interesting to me because Azure SQL Database has so much going for it in terms of all of the built-in performance tuning and optimization wizards. And if you've ever heard of advanced threat protection, the ability to extend all of that machine learning and security intelligence down to your on-premises SQL Server databases, that's pretty darn exciting to me. So here's my contact info. Here is a link to the resources, timw.info/arc. That will give you the slide deck in PDF form and also those scripts that I showed you that I consolidated from Microsoft's literature. As I said, my Twitter handle is TechTrainerTim. Feel free to send me a direct message. If you want a Pluralsight 30-day code, I'm happy to give you one of those. And my work email address is tim-warner@pluralsight.com. And that is about it. Thank you, everybody. And Kasam, back to you, kind sir.
See, there are many questions coming in. If we still have 3 minutes, so if at all anyone wants to ask something to Tim, they can just unmute and ask him directly. We have only 2 or 3 minutes left.
Hey Tim, Pushkar here. So, was a great session. So I just have a question around the delete lock that we are providing, and if you delete it, it'll just get rid of the agent, right? That's my question.
Could you repeat that last part of your question?
Sure. So when we are onboarding the machine, right, by installation of agents, and when we delete it through the blade, right? So what does exactly happen? So it's going to delete the agent itself because it's not going to delete the machine itself, right? So.
Right, exactly. That's a very good distinction, and congrats on your sharp eye. So the question and the point is, I mentioned that you can add resource locks to your Azure Arc servers. And one of the locks would prevent a delete action. Now, if an administrator went into the Azure portal and deleted an Azure Arc VM, what actually gets deleted? The VM on premises is not going to get deleted. It would just be the agent. So that's true. Let me quickly try that. Let me go to Arc machines. And let me go back to Win1. And I don't remember if I committed that lock. I did. Let me remove that lock. If it'll let me here. Come on now.
Oh, anyways, try it out anyways. But
Anyways, yeah,
obviously it's still
it's
not
not going to
doing the
delete the actual machine. It's just going to
correct.
delete it from being managed by Azure.
Sure. And any takes on Anthos versus Arc?
I don't know enough about Anthos to make any statement about it.
Okay.
Sorry about that. So I removed the Linux virtual machine from this environment. Now it would be a case of going to my Linux virtual machine and seeing if what's happened to that service. I haven't actually tested that. I'll do that after we get off the phone here, and if I find out anything interesting, I'll post it on my Twitter.
Sure.
Yeah, hi team, Ajay here.
Hi.
Hi. I would like to just know what are your challenges you face in Azure Arc? Like, what are your lessons learned? Could you please share with us?
Well, myself, in my line of work, I'm most interested in just what's happening under the hood. I'm particularly interested to know more about how desired state configuration is doing the guest configuration. I'm also just interested to know more about the Azure Policy options, what we'll be able to do with Windows and Linux virtual machines. You know, ultimately, it's like cool that you can manage your on-premises machines through Azure, but what can you actually do? And it looks kind of limited as of today, what's in Azure Policy. There's a few, and most of them are on Windows and not even Linux. So I think my biggest challenge now is to just have a deeper understanding of what we can do with it, because so little is available, unfortunately. So that's just a reminder to stay plugged in to the Azure Update site and Twitter and however you get your tech news to stay up to date.
Yeah, thanks, team.
You are welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.